Kia ora koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. My name's Martin Dutton. I'm the manager of the Transport and Urban Systems team here at the Climate Change Commission. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and hear about our three projects looking at how to decarbonise Aotearoa New Zealand in the coming decades. Just wanted to acknowledge the range of people we've got in attendance today, and that's fantastic to see. So thank you very much. Now, you will have the opportunity to break out into virtual breakout sessions, one on the emissions budgets, one on the 2050 target review, and one on the international shipping and aviation review. Now, there will be an opportunity then at the end to come back and hear further information about how you can make a submission and what the next steps are, as well as a question and answer session as well. So, apologies that our Chief Executive, Joe Hendy, is unable to make today, but I would like to welcome Barry Anderson, who is the General Manager of the Sector Analysis team, to just give us a little bit of information about what the Commission is and the work it does to advise the Government. Over to you, Barry. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Hello, my name is Barry Anderson. As Martin said, I'm the General Manager of Sector Analysis in the Commission, and I'm going to just spend a few minutes giving an overview of the Commission and our work program and these three pieces before you guys get into the details of these work streams. So I'm sure most of you are aware, but I'll try to move through these pretty quickly. The Commission is an independent Crown entity, and in that space, it's super important to understand that independence means that we're not directed by or we don't report to a minister. We deliver to a minister, but we report to and are directed by our board of 8 appointed board members right now. So it's up for the board to decide what our final advice to government will be, and the staff, myself and Martin and the other people that you'll see throughout the day, we work in the Secretariat to support the board's decision making and the workflows that they need to be able to do their job as appointed commissioners. One thing about the Commission is that we operate in an environment where it's kind of spooky, but it's also kind of comforting. We know our work program out to 2050 because we essentially have no discretionary capacity or headspace, and all of the work that we do is directed by the Act in terms of content, deliverables, and the timing. And so that's important to understand in this instance because you know, at this point in time, we're not doing the target review work or the emissions budget 4 work because there was just an election or because different things going on in the media or other spaces in industry. We're doing this work because the Act tells us it's the time to do it, and we'll do it again in 5 years for 2 of the 3 work streams. But it's just important to realize that what motivates us and what regulates our behavior. And the last thing worth mentioning is across all of these 3 work streams, there is an overarching set of guidance that Parliament decided was the right way for the Commission to think about doing all of this strategic climate policy direction work. And for you legislative nerds, then please write down Section 5M of the Act. But that's really a laundry list of the things that government has told us to think about, or Parliament, sorry, not government, told us to think about across all of the work we do to essentially legislate us being thoughtful. So whenever you're in these breakout rooms, it's useful for you to step back and think about, are these work streams or has this work adequately taken into account things like the state of scientific knowledge, technological development, the economic effects between regions and generations, and the Crown-Maui relationship, as well as other responses by parties to the Paris Agreement. That's just a real short snippet of those things. Let's see if this thing works. Okay. So we're here, we're in the middle of our 8-week consultation period on 3 pieces of work. As Martin said, one of those on the emissions budget 4 work, which is for the period of 2036 to 40. The other one, and the other 2 are about targets. And that's not targets for tomorrow, it's targets for 2050. So just with thinking about the timelines of all those pieces of work, it makes you step back and realize that man, the stuff that we're talking about now and making recommendations about and talking about assumptions and what's reasonable is going to influence the trajectory of the economy and the policy space for the next 20 to 30 years. Once you take a deep breath and digest that, it's pretty easy to understand why it's important for us to be reasonable, thoughtful, and make sure we get great input at the Climate Change Commission from folks like you. Therefore, the role of us for having this consultation period is not to be right or convince you that we are right about anything so far. We are showing you our homework, and the whole point of this exercise is for us to test our assumptions and provoke in-scope, high-quality feedback that can help us improve our work to date and deliver high-quality final advice to government. At the heart of all of this, our advice that we hand over at the end of 2024 to the Minister of Climate Change needs to be practical. And that is one of our main goals in engaging with you all, is understanding how the stuff that we think we know so far will, in fact, impact you all and interact with you all in the real world, in the organizations and the businesses and the daily lives that you lead. So we're asking you to put on your expert hat and think about, what about your industries and organizations? And what is in the way? What are your barriers, gaps, and opportunities for the decarbonization journey that you are trying to, or hopefully trying to understand, that your company, organization, or family can take? And I think the reason why it's important to take that view as we start diving into the details is that while the mid-century targets are quite a ways away, it's almost never too early to make the next good decision. And these pieces of work that we're consulting on will be setting up the framework, hopefully, for good decisions that will have impacts for a long time. Just a real quick one. These are the three pieces of work that we're consulting on. Martin already mentioned it. So the emissions budget's for 2036 to 40. I think some of you will join a breakout room for that one. The country's 2050 emissions target, which is kind of the guiding star or the North Star for climate policy in the country. Everything is set up to accord to meeting the target and that outcomes. And so the regular review process is an important kind of QA/QC element of the legislation, excuse me. And then this one time and one time only, should emissions from international shipping and aviation be brought in to the target and accounted for otherwise. So it's worth saying, just with this one slide before I flip over, that the budgets work and the work that's underway and all the scenarios and everything are with respect to the target of the day. These are not independent, these are not dependent what-if pieces of work going on. So we'll set emissions budget we'll give advice on emissions budget 4 to the government according to the targets in the CCRA right now. And at the same time, we'll give the government advice eventually on what to do about targets, if anything. And we'll see what the future holds after that. And this is the $1 million picture for the wisdom of Parliament in setting up the Commission and who should do what and at what irregular intervals. One of the pieces of work is, of course, the 2050 target. That's the major piece of kind of the linchpin of all of the architecture that happens after that to make climate action go. Emissions budgets are the stepping stones to get to the 2050 target. And those are expressed in net all gases CO2e. And emissions budgets are set, 10 to 15 years out in advance. Therefore, we're thinking about the emissions budget for the end of next decade rather than whereas emissions budget 1, 2, and 3 are in place. Once emissions budgets are in place and the country and business knows, generally speaking, what the government's going to shoot for in terms of outcomes, in behind comes emissions reduction plans, which are set 5 years in advance. And that is where the rubber hits the road for the private sector and us across the country, because that's where the government of the day will express its approach through the policy levers that it has to hitting the emissions budgets that have already been set. So the good thing about budgets is, they're longer term view, they're stable. You should know roughly what's the size of the prize as you look out and think about what you can do and what will impact you in your business. And after that, it's up for the details of government to figure out what should belong in emissions reduction plans. Worth noting is that for the top 3 layers of this pyramid with this top cut off, we give advice on the top 3. We do not give advice on the policies for the most part. Small exception under annual ETS prices and unit settings, but I'll set that to the side for now. The Commission does monitor the effectiveness and the adequacy of the emissions reductions plans and the policies therein. And that's a bit of a sneak preview, or hopefully something to pique your interest for mid-year this year. Around about middle of July, the Commission will be releasing the first of its annual emissions reduction monitoring reports, where we will communicate publicly and to the government basically on how it's going with the policies of the day to achieve the first emissions budget and have us on a trajectory to reach the long-term targets. I'm not sure if I really have to convince anyone why this work matters. Action on climate change around the world is it's obvious and evident, and the need for it is indisputable. So I won't try to convince anyone about that. Hopefully we're past that point. The question is how to go about this well and smart and create as much certainty as possible and be clear and transparent about where judgment's being exercised and where we think we need to take risk. The major risk to the globe is that there's an increasing awareness, and the conversation is getting louder about the reality of that we are in a situation as a globe that we're going to probably exceed 1.5 degrees of temperature change from pre-industrial times. And what will that mean for then trying to get into the strategy of basically claw back or drawing down or gaining that ground back, getting into a 1.5 degree world that scientists have warned us is kind of a dotted line for where risks of impacts become increasingly severe after that. Selfishly, or not selfishly, but realistically, action on climate change will affect New Zealand and everybody else's reputation across the other countries. So there's real socio-political and geopolitical, and also most likely economic concerns with action on climate and the role that the New Zealand government chooses to play in this transition. What's undoubtable is that the transition has begun. Countries all over the world are committing to things. Companies all over the world are committing to things. You're seeing green shoots of actions from all different sectors, from all different kinds of bodies. And this is a great chance to talk about what we think should be the main legislative apparatus in the country for making sure that New Zealand has an orderly, planned, and reasonable transition to a low emissions economy of the future. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Martin.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Barry. So now is the opportunity that we're going to go into the individual virtual breakout rooms. So in your on the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's 3 buttons. One button for session 1 is for the emissions budgets for work. So if you're wanting to go into that session, that's the button you press. Number 2 is for the 2050 emissions reduction target, and number 3 is for the International Shipping and Aviation Review. But a quick reminder, please, that I would advise everybody comes back to the end session once the breakout sessions have concluded, because there will be an opportunity to see what is next and have further questions and answers, where you can ask questions across any of the 3 projects. Now, because of the way the platform is working, you will need to just re-log in to rejoin the actual breakout sessions by putting your email address and your password in. So apologies about that. It's just the way the actual platform is set up. So I'd like you to please join your session now. We'll come back online in about 5 minutes time to just let us get set up for the session, and we'll see you at the session of your choosing. Kia ora.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the breakout session for the 4th emissions budget draft advice. I am Gillian Thornton, the manager of the emissions budgets team. And with me, I have Christy Marsh.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Christy Marsh, the project lead for this project.
So we have a few people who are going to be joining us today in this session, but I do encourage you to switch on your cameras, particularly for the question and answer session after the presentation that we will run through. So the session in total will be around 25 minutes. And let me actually go to the first slide because I think you're getting a sneak preview of our presentation. Right. Okay, let's start at the start. So this is the draft advice on the fourth emissions budget, and it talks to both what the level of the fourth emissions budget should be. So this is the period 2036 to 2040, as well as proposed revisions to budgets 1, 2, and 3, which have already been set by government. So in the session that you've just been in, Barry would have given you some context as to the role of emissions budgets in providing the stepping stones to the 2050 target. What I want to highlight here is that we are guided quite considerably by the Climate Change Response Act in terms of what the advice should cover, how we go about it, and also the timing. So the fact that we are providing advice in 2024 now is because it is set out in the Act. So every 5 years, starting from 2024, we are required to produce advice on emissions budgets. And at that time, in terms of the what, we're required to advise on the level, as well as revisions to budgets, the accounting rules that should apply, as well as a number of other factors, including the extent to which emissions of different greenhouse gases should decrease. But the last point is also the how, and this is quite an important point because it sets out the considerations that the Commission should take into account when proposing advice. So it's not just about emissions reductions and what is feasible from a technological perspective. It also is about balancing the impacts of the actions. So we are required, according to Section 5M of the Climate Change Response Act, to take into account the economic impacts, the environmental impacts, social the distribution of impacts across regions as well as across generations. So those are what inform our advice. And the other point that I wanted to highlight is that it also sets out that these emissions budgets and the advice on this is about how to meet emissions targets domestically. So it's as much as possible via emissions reductions that occur in New Zealand and removals as well domestically. So where have we landed with the draft advice? And the chart on the left shows you the first 3 bars are the emissions budgets that have already been set. And the 4th bar, the green one, is the proposed level for the 4th emissions budget. And you can see that it is a step down from emissions budget 3. And this is a good news story. It reflects the collective action that we have been taking sets us up well to achieve the 4th emissions budget. And this includes the actions that are embedded in achieving budgets 1, 2, and 3. The chart on the right shows the split between gross and net emissions. So this again, even though the target is a net target, the Act requires us to provide advice on the balance between gross emissions. And so this is emissions reductions that occur at source and removals that can occur by absorbing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as you can see, removals balance approximately half of gross emissions. Okay, so this is the essence of the budget's advice on the level. It shows you the implicit reductions in each of the different sectors in the demonstration path to get from budget 3 to budget 4. But it's worth just taking a moment to explain what exactly our demonstration path is. It is not a forecast of what we think will occur in the 2036 to 2040 period. Instead, it is the actions which are necessary and can be achieved, balancing those different considerations that I talked about to to get to the emissions budget, and it's what can deliver the largest benefit to the country as well, which I'll come to in a second. But what you can see from your slide there is that the biggest reductions occur in the transport, energy, and agriculture sector, and the role of forestry as well. So the key assumptions here for transport, it's about electrification for both light vehicles as well as heavy vehicles. But in addition to electrification, there is also a role for increased active transport, use of public transport as well, so that overall travel demand decreases. In the energy space, decarbonizing process heat is an important factor. Part of it is assumptions around the availability of an electric arc furnace for steel, and but also switching fuels away from carbon towards switching fuels away from coal towards other fuels for cement production in 2035 and for low and medium process heat by 2037. And in agriculture, we assume that methane-reducing technologies will become available in the fourth budget period. And this will reduce emissions from dairy and cattle, as well as further adoption of low methane breeding. Okay, so as I said, our modeling and analysis shows that this demonstration path and the budget set at this level can actually bring overall benefits to the economy. So while emissions are reduced, we are still assuming that the economy continues to grow and that the level of GDP will be 0.5% lower by the end of the budget period than it would be in a counterfactual, which is largely based on current government policy. But one of the really important things to note is that GDP doesn't capture some of the wider benefits associated with emissions reductions. So the benefits from healthier homes, from more active transport. And for the first time, we have actually been able to quantify some of these benefits. So particularly the benefit from reduced air pollution and better health outcomes as a result of fewer vehicle emissions. And what we have found is that this can be a sizable benefit, so 2.7 billion in each year in the budget period. Okay, so the second part of the advice is about proposed changes to budgets 1, 2, and 3. So the Act sets out that we can only propose revisions to these budgets for 2 reasons. So if there are methodological changes, so the way in which emissions are reported or measured, and if there are significant changes to the underlying considerations that the budgets were initially based on. And this sets quite a high bar for change, and is important because it ensures that set budgets actually do allow the certainty to businesses and households to act and invest, but at the same time allows flexibility to account for developments that occur over these very long time horizons that we are talking about. So where have we landed with the draft advice on this? Well, we are proposing that budgets 1, 2, and 3 are all revised for methodological changes. And this ensures that the level of ambition is maintained, because you're adjusting it for simply changes in the way emissions are accounted for. But we are also proposing that budgets 2 and 3 are revised for the higher levels of afforestation that we have seen between 2020 and 2022. So we've developed a framework for assessing significant changes, and this is the first time we are providing advice on that. And one of the important criteria there is, does a change that has occurred, does it change what is feasible for emissions reductions over the budget period? And the higher, our assessment is that the higher level of afforestation does fit into this category. The only other thing that I want to point out is that budget 1 is obviously started, we are in that period, and there is a very high bar an even higher bar for changes to budget 1, and the minister can only make changes in extraordinary circumstances or exceptional circumstances. So that's the end of the presentation. I will open it up for questions. Please feel free to just. Oh, can you guys hear us? My goodness, I'm just looking at the chat now.
Well, I could hear fine.
Yeah, I could hear fine as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, please jump in with questions. Raise your hand and we will get to you.
There's a question in the chat. Is there a reason why afforestation increased so much?
Yeah, so what we have been hearing is that that is part of the response to the emissions prices. Yeah, in the ETS, so the policy settings, the prices have been high, and one of the responses that has come through is that there have been high levels of forestry, particularly exotic pine.
Sophia?
Kia ora. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if, along with some of the kind of technological advances that you're hoping to achieve to meet the budget, are there any cultural or behavioural shifts that are modelled to meet these goals too, apart from the active transport?
Apart from the active transport, that's a good question. So what we have in coming to the demonstration path and the advice that we are proposing today, we have modeled a number of different scenarios, and these set out the different states of the world that can occur. So it's along the dimensions of technology as well as systems change. So systems change is a bit broader than behavior alone. It's about completely changing what can be produced and how it can be produced as well. So it shows in a high systems change, high technology world, what are some of the assumptions that would need to hold, and how much would emissions reduce by in that state of the world. And then the demonstration path is our assessment of what is economically and technically achievable and sits between the scenario range. So I guess to give you some other examples in the agricultural space, it's also about farm management practices. So there is a range of farm management practices that occur at the moment with different levels of efficiency. And one of the assumptions in the demonstration path is that if you can raise the efficiency to some of the more efficient farms, that's another way of delivering emissions reductions in a lower cost way.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, like reducing stocking rates, for example, would be a behaviour change, systems change in our scenarios that we've been looking at.
Awesome, thank you.
Troy?
Kia ora. Yeah, so I guess difficult question, but super important once we get out into the fourth budget period is a question I've asked a lot. Just simply, do we have enough information about the potential models for land use change, what products we could actually be producing then? You know, when we start talking about biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, the current collapse in finances and profitability in the sheep and beef sector, I tend to think we don't even know where we could be, and we don't as yet even calculate through sort of the petajoule equivalents of what we could grow on different patches of land or have reasonable confidence in what's there. What's your thinking in terms of how far that's gotten and what goes in the emissions budget versus recommendations for future research?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, and it's an important question for us to be thinking about. So yeah, What we do in the emissions budget space is focusing on the actions that are needed and that we think are feasible to achieve emissions reductions. So part of what you're talking about, so land use change. So we think about the so land use. So we think about sheep and beef farming, dairy farming. What is the what type of land is it on, and what are the returns to that land versus other uses, so forestry, for example, and that is incorporated into our thinking about budgets. So so in terms of the demonstration path, we do take it into account.
But I guess you're right, Troy, in the fact that we can only use the information and the evidence that we currently have, right? And the future is very uncertain, and no one can predict at this time what is going to happen. So I guess that is the advantage of being able to kind of give advice on emissions budgets every 5 years, so we can reevaluate what the latest evidence and information is kind of saying and telling us.
And also revising set budgets. So we consider what new information has occurred since the budgets have been set, and then it can be changed to account for important developments.
Yeah,
does that answer the question?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that the sense I have of it is that, perhaps the acid test is to really think about whether, if you were taken back to 1985 or so like that, had to project forward the 30 years to get to where we are now, how would your methods do? And if you really have confidence in that, I'd suggest that, what we're looking at is actually harder. It's a bit like Manuka honey on steroids, in the sense of, maybe that method of just taking the petajoule equivalent, saying, well, you could grow grass, you could grow coppiceable vegetation, but what would that actually be worth as pellets or wood to put in dairy factories? What would it be worth as a proportion of that could be turned into sustainable aviation fuel on site? And have you worked through those so that the demonstration path and some other reasonable scenarios that you could put in have started to work through what's possible, so that you do at least have some bracketed scenario there for high biofuel as one of the things that you should consider? I guess that's one of the things that would be really interesting and important to ponder once you're out in that period past 2035. And I think the fourth commitment period, or the fourth budget period, is really where it becomes just absolutely essential.
Yes.
That we're starting to see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I think that's really all. I'm keen to hear what you think. Just press that point a little bit, since that seems to be what we're here to do.
No, absolutely. And I guess the answer to your question is yes, we do take a systems approach in thinking about what is achievable in the different sectors of the economy. So I talked about earlier the marginal land and whether it's possible to move into alternative sources. But another example of how it feeds through and what you're talking about is biofuels. And so we're thinking about decarbonizing particularly hard to decarbonize sectors. So long haul travel, heavy vehicle transport, and so part of the modeling is actually thinking about about biofuels, where that can come from, integrating it with the forestry assumptions as well.
Great. Yeah, well, I'm keen to see more of what you're coming up with. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Now, we do have a few questions that have popped in on the chat. It'll just take us a minute to get to them and figure ourselves out. Here we go. All right, so what's the first one that's come through? Oh, there's a number here. Okay, we've done the first one. So this is from Ian. There's a heavy reliance on afforestation. How much land are you expecting we will need to be planted to achieve the forecast reductions? Are you assuming that it will be exotic species for commercial forestry, and what are the risks with relying on this? Okay, it's important to note with this one that our assumptions around forestry are based on in terms of the demonstration path, we think about what is achievable in the gross emissions space. So given technologies and behavioral change that we've just been talking about, what are the emissions reductions that are possible? And then we overlay it with the forestry assumptions that are that we think are achievable as well. And this goes back to the analysis of the available land and what can be planted on there. So in terms of the demonstration path itself, between 2021 and 2030, our assumption is that there's about 50,000 hectares of land that are planted each year, and that will reduce to about 35,000 hectares per year from 2050 onwards. And I guess there's a couple of other things to say in relation to this. So forestry plays an important role in the budgets, and it allows us to go further with climate ambition than otherwise, and is a more cost-effective solution as well compared with other carbon capture and storage solutions that are available overseas and discussed overseas. But really what we are talking about here is not running a strategy which is reliant on forestry removals. It is also balancing the gross emissions reductions which are possible. And what we have highlighted in this advice is that there are substantial benefits from this approach.
Oh, the next question we've got here.
This
mouse. Oh, it's that mouse, wrong mouse. Okay. What impact assessment has been made to social and economic, to agricultural sector for proposed changes? What section is this in report?
Yeah, and I think what this is getting to is the fact that there are impacts that are going to be felt unevenly across the different sectors of the economy. And like you say, the agricultural sector is one of these sectors. In the report itself, it is chapter 4, is it, which sets out all of the different sectoral impacts.
Chapter 5 is the impacts chapter. Chapters. Yeah, it's the sectoral chapter.
Yeah, so I'd point you to a combination of the two, because chapter 4 tells you each of the different sectors, what are the assumptions, and then helps you, provides a good framework for actually looking at chapter 5, which is the impacts itself. But again, what this advice is about actions, and impacts are going to be really influenced by the policy choices and policy settings which enable these actions. And that is out of scope of this advice. That is a role for government, and the government has many levers to implement and support the actions that are needed for decarbonisation.
Cool. So does, and if so, how, the demonstration path consider a carbon price that is supporting the economic feasibility of the different activities?
Look, that's a good question, and an important one, which does come up quite often. So in terms of our modelling, there are probably a couple of points to make. The first one is when we look at the, we've got a very rich technology model ends, which I was talking about earlier, which has a lot of the different technologies and connections between the different sectors. And for the most part, for many sectors, a lot of the technology assumptions are exogenous, but for assumptions around EV uptake as well as electricity generation, it is driven by a carbon price, and that carbon price is an exogenous assumption. So we take the government's projections for the carbon price, and that's what feeds into the model. And so that allows us to make an assessment of what is feasible or not. The other point is when we think about impacts, which is in the C-plan model, yes, that is a general equilibrium model, and there is a emissions value, which is an important part of that model. But that is not a reflection of an ETS price or a carbon price. And that goes back to what I was saying just a little bit earlier, that this is about the actions, and there are multiple different policies that could support the delivery of these actions. And it's not just pricing, the ETS, but there is a role for complementary policies as well. So what you will see as a emissions value and C plan should not be interpreted as a carbon price.
Which scenario options for EB4 were considered where there was no reduction in GDP compared to reference?
Where there was no reduction in GDP.
The low-tech, low systems.
There's a number of things to unpack here. And the first is, when we talk about GDP and in the demonstration path, we are talking about a level in 2040, which is 0.5% lower than it would otherwise be. That is small. It's likely to be overestimated as well, because what we tend to find is that technology and activity and behavior, moves a lot faster than we tend to forecast. So if you think about electric vehicle uptake, or even about solar and wind technology, and how rapidly that has changed, and the reduction in costs. All of that would suggest that GDP, if any, our estimates of GDP in the current modelling framework would be overestimating what the economic impact would be. And like I said in the presentation as well, it doesn't actually account for some of the broader economic benefits. So yeah, GDP is a measure of the size of the economy. It's not a measure of well-being. So those are important points to consider when we are talking about the economic impact. And I guess the other point to note is that a number of other when you look at the literature internationally, it's increasingly, you're finding that there are a lot of opportunities to the economy as well. And the investment can actually drive economic growth as well. And so, yeah, in some of the other jurisdictions, you're seeing estimates which aren't a negative. And I guess the other point, I know I'm talking a long time about this, but the other point is when we start thinking about the impacts of climate change and the damage estimates, what we're increasingly seeing is that those are very, very sizable relative to what we are discussing in terms of the costs of mitigation.
And I think we've run out of time.
Oh, have we run out of time? Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, we do have to wrap up and move to the plenary session now. Apologies that we haven't gotten through all of your questions. If you do want to raise them again, we have half an hour with the broader group. So this is the targets as well as international shipping and aviation projects, and we can discuss the answers then. So I encourage you to stick around for that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Right, cool. Welcome, everyone. I'd like you to encourage to turn your cameras on, for those who've already done it, just to foster more of a discussion type atmosphere. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the review of the 2050 target. We'll run through a brief presentation. If you're familiar with the material, please bear with us. If you're not familiar, hopefully this will do a good grounding in the material, and then an opportunity to ask questions. Please do put your questions in the chat and we'll try and get to them. We need to finish this session at about 1:45, but if you've got further outstanding questions, please bring them to the plenary session at the end and we can tackle them there. My name's Sam King. I'm the manager of the law team and the project owner for the 2050 target review, and with me is my colleague Corwin Wallens, who's the lead author of a particular piece of work. So I'm going to jump in to the presentation, and this is before, please, a question, just type it in the chat as it comes up. For at the end, we'll also go reasonably quickly, again, just due to time constraints. So we start with Can everyone see the slides? Yeah, thank you. We start with what our current target is. And so that current target is to achieve net zero of all greenhouse gases except for biogenic methane by 2030 and for every calendar year thereafter. Key point about this is it's a net target. That means that carbon emissions can be offset by technology that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, and at the moment that's trees in forests. Then there are two components relating to biogenic methane, both off a 2017 baseline, and you can see those are on the screen. Key point there is that's a gross target, can't be offset by removing gases from the atmosphere. And we'll talk about why there's a difference between those two targets and that matters. Also, to say this excludes emissions from international aviation and shipping. This just concentrates on New Zealand's domestic emissions. So there are two questions that the legislation asks us to look at. The first is, how does our target contribute to the purpose of the Act? And the key purpose of the Act here is for a clear and stable framework to contribute to global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So, in other words, what's our contribution to global efforts to limit warming to 1.5? Parliament set the targets in 2019, cross-party support, and it's a high bar for change. So what they've asked us to do is look at a significant, capital S, significant change has occurred or is likely to occur since the target was set. And then a second question is whether or not that actually justifies a change in the target. As I said, there's two components to the target, one for carbon dioxide and similar gases and one for methane. The reason for that is that they behave very differently in the atmosphere and have different impacts on warming. And science can give us an understanding of what those warming are, but that's where that sort of runs out. And after that's a value judgment about what our contribution to the world should be and how that impacts our domestic equity and fairness. So here you can see the effect of carbon dioxide pulses. Just ignore the scale. The key point here is that it lasts a long time and doesn't decay very fast in the atmosphere in terms of the warming effect of carbon dioxide. Then if you continue to emit carbon dioxide, you get a constant linear temperature increase as the layers of carbon dioxide build upon each other. And that's the critical problem that causes the bulk of global warming worldwide. But in New Zealand, we have a significant contribution from methane, which is quite differently. It has a very short-lived pulse in the atmosphere in terms of its warming effect. Now, you can't see the scale because these verge into scientific numbers, but it's much more powerful while it's in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And even decays as you build up these pulses, and this is a stylized graph of a pulse every 5 years. In reality, though, every day, you get this that builds up a significant warming effect, even though each individual pulse decays. And then we put all of that together and we get the temperature impacts of warming from New Zealand's emissions over the last 150 years projected into the future based on a path that is our current target. Two things I want to say about this. One here, as you can see, the bulk of that warming is caused by methane. Two, that this does not include deforestation. If it would be significantly higher temperature increases. Then thirdly, that temperature increases at just over 0.003 degrees Celsius and decline to about 0.0028. They may seem very small numbers, but New Zealand's a very small place. One way of looking at our contribution to the world is what if everyone in the world had an equal share of a 1.5 degree warming budget. And you can see the dotted line there that represents what that would mean warming share would be based on our population. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Corwin to talk us quickly through the significant change and what we found there and what the next steps are.
Thank you. So Sam's just given the highlights of how we look at New Zealand's contribution to global warming, and that's chapter 2 of the report. I'll talk through our findings on whether things have significantly changed, which is chapter 3 of the report. And as Sam said, Parliament set the target. We need to be finding things have changed significantly since then in order to be recommending as part of our review any changes. And so when we're looking at significant change, we're looking for changes that are important. So that we're looking at the right indicators, and it's important in terms of, you know, a 2050 long-term climate target. We need the change we see to be consequential, so it needs to be large enough to impact things, and we also need it to be notable. And so that's the way of saying it needs to be. The change needs to have been unexpected when the target was set in 2019. You know, no one expected things to stay the same. Things need to have changed from expectations. And so we looked across the 9 areas, and we did find a significant change in 4 of those areas. So global action, and that's to do with how the world's tracking on achieving that 1.5 goal. And we basically, in the report, we go through it, but the news there is we're not on track as a world globally to meet that 1.5. And that's and our ability to meet that target has been impacted by the, I guess, level action we've had since 2019 as a globe. The other part of the significant change in global action is since New Zealand set its target, other countries have been setting their targets, and they've gone further with what I call an all gas net zero target. So any of their methane emissions are offset by removals of other gases. We've got a significant change in the scientific understanding of climate change. That's to do with the impacts we have at each degree of sort of increment of warming, and so those impacts are going to be worse, lower temperatures, and that's on the work of the IPCC and changes in the forecast from AR5 to AR6. We've got a significant change in technological developments, and so that's 3NOP, which is a methane inhibitor that in the right circumstances can reduce methane emissions from ruminant animals by 30%. We do acknowledge that it's not the method where you have to be administrating it as the cattle are eating. It doesn't work for the New Zealand pastoral system, but we found that as a significant change because it's gone from something that was kind of a hope to a proven option, and looking into the future about what's likely to occur, we think there's a good chance that it will be adopted for New Zealand systems. And the final significant change we found was to do with the social license of forestry, and forestry is really interesting topic here because, you know, we need forestry to help provide removals, to help with the difficult to make emissions. We could also be drawing on forestry for if we have an overshoot of 1.5, getting back to that 1.5 level. But we've also heard that the social impacts on rural communities of large-scale forestry, the impacts of things like flash and other events, really undermining the social license for that forestry, and so we found that a significant change. And so the remaining 5 topics we did find a significant change, which isn't to underplay the impact on people's lives. Some changes here can have and will be having, but it's, you know, we've got looking at those criteria, looking at a climate target out to 2050, you can find the remaining 5 topic areas, and a few questions about those, I'm happy to elaborate at the presentation. But we did find, so we have not yet identified target changes or considered whether a change to the target is justified. We want to have this consultation step before we get into that part of the project. But we do have a clear direction of change. We have found no evidence to support weakening the current targets and enough to consider strengthening the current target. So that's looking at the direction of the significant changes we found. But there are many types of, you know, positive and negative impacts that could result from strengthening the 2050 target, and that's what we want to look at more. And so our next steps In our final advice to the government, at the end of the year, we will answer 2 more questions. We will look at if found a significant change, does that justify amending the 2050 target? And if amendments to the 2050 target are justified, what should those changes be? So at the end of the day, we'll have a recommendation of either retaining the current target or moving to an alternative target and specifying that target. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. So now move to questions. Please put your questions in the chat or feel free to raise your virtual hand and we will be able to come to questions. We've got one to start off with from Matt. How is the review affected by the review of methane the government announced recently? The short answer is it's not. These are 2 completely separate things. Doing this because what the legislation asked us to do, and the methane review is a political process to coalition agreement and has no relation to the other. Got any further questions?
Yes, I could just add with that methane review, the government's commitment. Government's welcome to take advice as it deems necessary, and ultimately the government will be making the choice around the target, and they'll be looking at different streams of advice, and that's how things should work.
So next question is, what kind of target changes might we look at? So the Act enables us to look at changes to basically any part of the target. We could recommend a change to the timeline, so how soon we might recommend emission reductions, the level of emissions reductions that we think is appropriate for our contribution, what we call the structure, so whether or not we keep this gas structure, and I'll take the opportunity to say we haven't found any evidence that would cause us to think that abandoning the split gas structure is a good thing, and that or we could change what we call the rules, which is what things count for emissions reductions, what things count for emissions removals, what we should do about removals, including potential targets for removals, and what we should do about offshore mitigation. And final point is, when we look at, we say strengthening, we mean probably either emissions reductions on a sooner timeframe or greater emissions reductions, or a combination of both of those 2 things. So the next question is, are we likely to meet our current target? That's really a question for our monitoring advice, which is due in the next couple of months, in which we assess the adequacy and the view on where we're going and what the future would look like in terms of whether we have a current target.
But also, as I'm sure Barry outlined earlier in the introduction, this is where the system comes in. So we have our 2050 target, where we're trying to get to. Then underneath that, we have the emission budgets, which break it down into the sort of 5 years. What level do we need to be at? And so to get a good idea of whether we're on track or not, it's a case of, well, are we meeting those emission budgets?
Yeah. So next question from Kath. One of the unexpected issues must surely be the faster deterioration of the forecasts for climate change impacts. Another must be the lack of action and the reluctance of governments to act. How do you articulate those in your advice, especially the latter in New Zealand? So we've looked at both of these issues. So one is, as you described, is the fast deterioration of the forecasts. That is what we looked at in the scientific understanding of climate change. The scientific understanding is showing that the impacts of climate change are going to affect us at a lower level of temperature than we previously thought. And that's a combination of greater understanding of the climate system, but also greater understanding of human systems and how those 2 things interact. The way it was brought home to me is just an anecdotal example. Is after Cyclone Gabrielle, did a flood map of the flooding Hawke's Bay, which really, if you look at the map, doesn't actually look that big, but where all the people were and really significantly affected those people. And it's that interaction of systems that we've got a greater understanding of. The second one is the lack of action and reluctance governments to act. One said the world is not on track to hit the 1.5 degree goal. And one of the reasons for that is, as you see, a lack of global action in this space. And then we're still to think through what that might mean for our target, but it's definitely something we think is a significant change since 2015.
So I've got another question here, which is, if there are a lot of submissions from the public asking for changes to the 2050 target, does that make it more likely to be changed? Or what other factors would influence the Climate Change Commission advising the government to change their target? So consultation definitely is a really large part in our advice, and that's why we're encouraging people to submit. The things that really help out are understanding, do you add to our analysis? Is there something that we haven't considered that you think we should? But also hearing your views on, if we're planning significant changes and you agree with them, what would you do as a result? So all those are things we'd really encourage people to submit on if they would like to, and that will influence advice. So the significant change findings that we have there, they're initial, they're not final. We'll look again with the benefit of the consultation. And then when we're looking at should we change the target, we'll be factoring in the kind of impacts a stronger target. And so hearing your views on that is also really useful.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, we need to find that something has certainly changed to even consider whether or not the target should change. So your insights and evidence on whether you agree or disagree with our significant changes is very useful. And your views on what our contribution to the world would be. What about, next question is what about COVID? Big economic hit to New Zealand, why wasn't that a significant change? Look, COVID was a big challenge and a big economic hit, and has had an inflationary hangover and the associated rise in cost of living. What we did is try to look through short-term economic fluctuations to look to the long-term economic paradigm out to 2050 and beyond. When we do that, we found that nothing has significantly changed that wasn't, or is likely to change, wasn't already foreseen in New Zealand, foreseen in 2019. That's the reason why we took into account, but when you look through the short-term fluctuations.
And so, our main indicators there were GDP per capita, so that's the economy's ability to, manage the transition, and also the government's fiscal position, which is, the government's tools and ability to pull fiscal levers. So we looked at actuals and the forecasts, and ultimately on that kind of time frame, they haven't changed.
Next question is, how do we factor in likely impacts on climate if the fast track bill is passed? Look, we're not experts on the fast track bill. I would probably say it really depends on what projects are fast tracked. Projects themselves are more likely to influence New Zealand's emissions. And certainly we've pointed out before that we need significantly greater investment in public transport and significantly greater investment in renewable energy, and the sooner that sort of stuff gets built, the better. But we're not experts on the ins and outs of the fast track bill itself. Next question, is the Commission making submissions on the science system review? What would your advice about that be? Again, we're not experts in this space, so I don't know whether we'll be making a submission on the science system review. As a general rule, we don't make submissions on those processes. The key thing is that science is really important. It's an integral part of this. It needs to be robust. It needs to be well understood. It needs to have the ecosystem to support weeding out bad science through peer review and consensus building. And that's what underpins our advice on the scientific aspects. Do you want to take that question?
So we have a question saying the discussion document says there has been no significant changes in distributional impact, generation or equity, but if emissions have not reduced as much as hoped or expected or committed to, doesn't that mean there will be more impact on future generations and vulnerable populations? I mean, this is a very good question. How do we factor in if emissions aren't on track, and do we pull that sort of thinking through into, well, that's a social change that's about to happen, or that's an intergenerational equity change that's about to happen? We'd say we haven't, within the New Zealand context, we haven't got a finding. We're not on track. We haven't got a finding either way. That advice is to come later on in the year, so it's a bit early for us to make judgments on that. As far as, well, if the world's not on track, what does that mean? I guess it really depends on what it does about the situation that it's not on track. And we are keeping an eye out through global action on what other countries are committing to with their targets. And we are also factoring in that global action space that the world is on track, and what does that mean for New Zealand's climate targets? And you can imagine different responses, but it does point to looking at strengthening the target is our initial finding there.
Yeah, and we also look at things like vulnerable populations through the impacts of climate change that I talked about before. Philippa, I see you've got your virtual hand up, and this might need to be the last question before we return to the plenary session. Philippa.
Kia ora. Thank you. Aren't we in real trouble? I mean, my understanding is that actually our emissions have reduced very little since about 2006. And that aren't we only really going to have serious reduction when we dramatically reduce both production and consumption? And even the IPCC mentions that. And there's absolutely no social license for it. We do talk about renewable energy, and it looks like we're looking, digging up environmentally sensitive areas in order to be able to build that renewable energy. But even so, my understanding is that that's only ever going to be the icing on the cake. And I'm worried that there's a large elephant in the room here, and nobody seems to be mentioning it. I think it's the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. They do forecast an increase in emissions next year, and I understand that our recent decrease was actually because we had a lot of rain in our hydro schemes. So my worry is we are in real trouble, and I don't see what we do.
Sure. So I think what I'd say is the impacts of climate change, even at 1.5 degrees, are still going to be very serious, and that's why we think that mitigation from New Zealand and overseas, and New Zealand's leadership and that is incredibly important. Also say that in terms of reducing emissions, we need a range of solutions, whether that be public transport, whether that be renewable energy, whether that be technology that changes emission profiles, whether that be technology that changes the route of an animal to reduce methane, whether that be land use change to less greenhouse gas intensive types of land. All of that is needed. So we need changes in technology and the way that we work, live, and play.
And I guess you've got the target review, which is about, are we aiming the right levels of emissions reductions for New Zealand? The budget, splitting that out into the 5-year chunks so we can check we're on track for where we're aiming for. Underneath that, we've got the emissions reduction plans, which are the strategies, how we get those emissions down, what we're relying on, what we need to move forward and do. And then under that, you've got the policies. And so I'd agree as far as we need the policies to be adding up to the changes we need strategy. We need that to be adding up to the 5-year points, and we need that to be adding up to a target that is aiming at the right spot. And ultimately that's how we can make our contribution.
Thank you very much, everyone. If you'd like to return to the plenary session, and if you've got further questions, please do ask them there, even if they're target specific, because others might benefit from your question on targets. So I hope we'll see you there in just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
All right, I think people have had long enough to join the session now. So can people that are online just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Excellent, thank you. Great. All right then, kia ora. I've already introduced myself during the plenary session, but I'd like to introduce Rob Carr, not to be confused with Rod Carr. This is Robert Carr, and Rob is the principal analyst in our team and the lead analyst for the International Shipping and Aviation Review. So it's a pleasure to see you online. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. So you're here for the International Shipping and Aviation Review. And so, as I say, we're reviewing whether international shipping or emissions of international shipping and aviation should be included within the 2050 target or not. And if they are, then how do we do that? So we've distilled it into really three key areas for you. And there's a lot of discussion in the discussion document. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to go in and through and have a look at that. But if not, we'll walk you through some of the high-level steps that we've undertaken, as Barry said, to show our homework. And we would very much welcome your submission on whether there are any gaps, whether you agree with us, whether there's anything that you think we've missed. So, as I said, there's a lot of information in the discussion documents, but at the crux of it, we are looking at whether and how. And these two are intertwined. We can't look at one without the other. We're looking at the target, so the top three of the pyramid that Barry showed. We're looking at those targets themselves rather than the policies that will actually enable us to get here. And the reason for that is because if we did suggest a target was set that included international shipping and aviation, there are a number of different ways that could be achieved. So the process is that we would provide the advice to the government. The government has a year to come back to us on whether it accepts that advice or wants to change it. And then that will kickstart a process off for the actual policy direction itself. And then we are really interested in your perspectives on the implication for New Zealand, and that's across businesses, that's across the country as a whole, and for people and individuals themselves. And that's for both inclusion and exclusion. So in terms of what we're looking at, we are looking at international shipping and aviation. We are excluding emissions from shipping and aviation within the country, so from port to port within New Zealand, and also fishing as well, whether it goes into international waters. Now, the reason for that is because the domestic emission from shipping and aviation and the fishing emissions are already captured under the 2050 target. In reviewing this work on international shipping and aviation, we're looking at the purpose for clear and consistent climate change policies as well. So how do we create a framework that's going to allow us to get to the 2050 net zero target, but with a clear and consistent direction? And Barry's already mentioned Section 5M of the Climate Change Response Act, which is essentially our guidebook for how we do this. So we're looking at things like the scientific evidence behind what we're assessing. We're looking at any technological developments. We're looking at any ecological impacts. We're looking at any environmental impact. We're looking at impacts on the economy. We're looking at social and intergenerational impacts, and also impacts on iwi Māori. And as we said, what other countries who are signed up to things like the Paris Agreement are actually doing in this space as well. Now, as Barry said, this is in theory a one-off review. Unlike the 2050 target and the emissions budget for review, which are 5-year cycles, the review of international shipping and aviation is in theory a one-off review. It could change if in the future, but that would require a legislative change, which would be quite complex as well. Just a quick that we aren't recommending specific policies that could be to actually meet the targets, including the emissions, such as whether the emissions should be priced or added to the emissions trading scheme as well. That would be a choice for the government under future emission reduction plans if it decided to add these to the target. So that's a question that comes up quite often for us is whether it means automatic inclusion within the ETS, and the answer is no. I should also say that there are a question and answer function. So if you want to go into the chat function, you can ask any questions as we go along. There will be an opportunity at the end for the question and answers. But if you think of anything as we're going along, then please feel free to put it in the chat. So a little bit of key context in this space. So we know that historically, emissions from shipping and aviation were thought to contribute to about 2% of the world's emissions. That has been, estimated recently to be around double that, so 2 or even possibly 5% for each individual sector. And we also know that the trajectory is growing for each of the sectors as well. Now action is taken, they could end up using about 20% of the maximum emissions that we have left down at the 1.5 degree threshold. Now, there is work going on in this space. So New Zealand is signed up to several agreements under the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization as well. And they are basically coordinating global action on emissions from international shipping and aviation. And it's really consistent that whatever we do here is really important, that whatever we do here is consistent with these agreements as well. But they've been quite clear that they can't do this on their own, and they're looking at member states like New Zealand to come on board and complementary action in this space to enable us to decarbonise as quickly as possible. On that, we're not the first to do this. So there are major economies like the UK, the USA, and even the European Union that are already putting targets in place for decarbonisation of international shipping and aviation. And to actually achieve these, they're already starting to put policies in place as well. One of the things that we're really clear on, though, is that we know that Aotearoa New Zealand is quite frankly miles away from anywhere. So we're quite dependent on shipping and aviation to meet the needs of our population. So what we also are aware, though, is that international organisations have already started asking businesses to show their decarbonisation efforts across the board, and it will potentially lock people out of organisations out if they can't show that they are decarbonising their operations right across the supply chain. So on to the actual review itself. And the first question is a relatively simple question. Do we actually include international shipping and aviation in the 2050 target or not? So there's three options that we've been. So we can either include it, we could exclude it, or we can reconsider. Now, when I say we could, what I mean is that we provide the advice to the government, and it's up to the government to make the final decision on that. Our initial finding is that inclusion of international shipping and aviation within the 2050 target is consistent with both national and international targets. We do require further analysis to actually do that. Now, one of the key things is that, as I said earlier, we can't look at whether without looking at how. So the question of how is really broken down into 4 key components within the discussion document. So the first, how do we count these emissions? So there are several different possibilities, and we really value your judgment on which way we should potentially look at advising the government. So we could look at refueling, for example, or bunkering, as it is commonly known. And we know that for aviation, it's probably likely to be a relatively okay measure, but it could possibly underestimate the amount of emissions that come from ships. We know that there is relatively little bunkering within New Zealand from international ships, which obviously can carry large volumes of fuel. There's no longer the site at Northern Point. So it's likely to underestimate the amount of emissions generated through shipping. We could look at something like to and from the next port as well. So when international vessels, whether they be aircraft or ships, come into New Zealand, we'd look where the last port was and then calculate the emissions to and from the next port. And in that, there is a potential range of exactly how much of those emissions that we should look at taking. Now, that is a potential option that we could look at that would be consistent with other places like the European Union, for example. Another thing that we have to do is consider what other impacts of greenhouse gas emissions are. So looking at things like, the contrails from aeroplanes, looking at things like reflective wake from ships and the impacts that have on greenhouse gases and global warming. But again, we're looking at this, done our analysis, and we think it could be a potential for reconsidering this until the science is more certain. But we really value your perspectives on this, including whether you've got any scientific basis for inclusion or exclusion otherwise. The next thing we have to do is, and one of the probably the most complex tasks, is to actually look at the structure of the target if we were to include it within the 2050 target itself. So at the moment, we've got a net zero target and a separate biogenic methane target. So we could potentially, as option one, look at including international shipping and aviation within the net zero component of the target. That would allow transferability and fungibility between different sectors and offsetting as well. A second option we could look at is actually carving international shipping out into its own component, like they do with the biogenic methane. Again, that would allow transferability between shipping and aviation, but this would be a gross target, so you wouldn't be able to necessarily offset. A third option is to carve international shipping and carve international aviation out separately. We know that the technological pathways for decarbonisation for international shipping are quite different to international aviation. One of the options is that we could actually look at having those done separately as separate targets. Final option, which is not listed up here, but it's similar to option 3, is that we could create those two separate components for international shipping and international aviation, but also allow some offsetting as well. Similar to how to do with operations like from the International Civil Aviation Organization. The very last thing as part of the how is how do we assess the level of emissions reduction to aim for? So where on the band and the range do we want to be? Do we want to be pushing really hard and fast, or do we want to be kind of following a little bit by just including a small amount of these emissions? So again, we've left fairly open within the discussion document itself. I'm keen to have your input to help us make the final decision to provide to the government. Okay, that's actually the end of our discussion itself, and we will go into this in a little bit more detail. But to actually make a submission, you can go to the haveyourSay.climatecommission.gt platform and download the discussion documents and go through the online questionnaire there. You can also submit via email or post as well, but the submissions do need to be received by the end of 31st of May 2024. Now, I'm actually going to hand over to you guys now for any questions and answers that you might have. So please, again, just a reminder, put them in the chat function where we can actually send messages, and we'll go through those one after one. I'll give you a few minutes to come up with your questions. if you'd rather say them out loud, then feel free to come off mute and actually ask them in person as well.
I just have a question. Thank you very much for that presentation. That's super useful. I was just wondering, despite not advising on policy measures through this advice, have you done any analysis on the policy options that the government may have beyond pricing?
Yep, absolutely. So recommending specific policies be by the government isn't in scope of this advice. What policies are possible really inform what your target could be and how you could set it. So as part of this discussion document, we've set out some of the policy options that the government could use. So in addition to pricing, you also have regulatory models. So a lot of countries overseas, for example, are adopting minimum use requirements for sustainable aviation fuels to try and guarantee demand for those fuels to help production for them be increased and down the cost of that transition over time. And you see that in markets like Singapore, Japan, the EU, and others. And the other sort of model you see is an incentive-based model to try and down the cost to encourage people to use the fuel and to produce it, which we see in the United States and in Australia as well. So there's pathways the government could go down to help reduce these emissions, and they've got policy choices within that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question, Natalie. So a few questions popping up now. So the first one's from Ad. Is there any international best practice that New Zealand could follow? What the UK, USA and EU are doing?
Yes, so with the discussion document, we've set out a bit about what those three in particular are doing. So the UK is the most similar to our own, with sort of their own 2050 target, and what they have done is include international shipping and aviation within the overall net zero target, and they're looking at a mix of incentives and regulations to help support the industry there. In the EU, they have sort of the most comprehensive set of policies in this, which is again focused on sort of heavy regulatory mix and some incentives in there as well. The United States has opted more for an incentives model, so they're looking at what they do to bring down the cost of sustainable aviation fuel and encourage investment in alternative maritime fuel technology. And we've also had a look at what a number of other jurisdictions around the world are doing as well in terms of reducing their policies and their emissions. And yeah, welcome any feedback people on other countries we should be looking at for examples as well, or if there's anything we've missed from our analysis there.
Thank you, Rob. So next one is more of a comment rather than a question. So from Tama, thank you very much, Tama. Include in the plan, separate the industries so they can manage and arrange their own innovation and transgression into emissions reduction. For a quick change and pressure our partners and allies to change. Thank you very much, Tama. We'll certainly get that on board, and we'll capture that as part of this this feedback as well, and make sure that that is part of the analysis that we do at the end. One from Larissa. You mentioned that the IMO, for example, that's the International Maritime Organization, would like countries to help with this. They requested specific areas that would help.
Yes, so for the International Maritime Organization, they are looking at different measures at an international level themselves. So they're looking at putting pricing in place and fuel standards in place from 2027, and they already have some efficiency standards in place. They've specifically requested and encouraged states to take action as in helping support the production of alternative fuels and in making sure their domestic regulatory environment supports the adoption of new technologies. On the international aviation side, the International Civil Aviation Organization already has pricing in place at an international level for aviation. In addition to those measures that the IMO encourages, they also encourage states to set targets either for their emissions or for sustainable aviation fuel use. and to put in place requirements for a minimum blend of alternative fuels to be used, are tools that they encourage countries to look at.
So we've got a competitive question now. What's Australia doing in this space, international shipping and aviation?
Yeah, so Australia established a Jet Zero Council for aviation a couple of years ago, which is looking at what their policy in this space should be. In their budget that they actually just announced a few days ago, they announced a really significant multi-billion-dollar investment in alternative fuels and alternative materials to support the transition, with particular focus on sustainable aviation fuel. And they are also investigating the introduction of a sustainable aviation fuel mandate. So a minimum requirement, a minimum percentage of sustainable aviation fuel would need to be used by international aviation providers.
Thanks, Rob. Now, I've got quite a few questions coming through, which is absolutely fantastic. I know that we've only got about 3 or 4 minutes remaining until we go back into the plenary session. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to just say, if we don't get to your question, then please feel free to ask it within the plenary session. We can answer it in front of everybody. If we still don't get around to answering your question, or you don't feel that we've answered it fully enough, then you can feel free to email it through to have your say at climatecommission.govt.nz, and we'll be gladly answer online for you as well. Before we do go back to the plenary session, we've got Casey, thanks for your awesome mahi. I was wondering whether other forms of emissions not currently counted from consumption of goods and services have been considered being added into the budget or at a high level.
So that's not in the scope of the piece of work that we're doing currently. In the advice on the second emission reduction plan, the Commission released last year, we noted a number of countries are moving to implement what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which prices goods when they come into the country based on the emissions in them. And we're seeing put in place for the EU already, and a number of other markets looking to adopt it. And we flagged that one of the options for New Zealand going into the future is to actually replace our industrial allocation system, where we currently give free units under the emissions trading scheme, with a scheme like that to help balance the markets for goods produced domestically versus international goods instead. The government will be consulting on its second emission reduction plan later in the year, so that's an opportunity for that to be considered.
There are some fantastic questions coming through, so if we haven't got to your question, again, just a reminder to come back to the plenary session where there'll be a further opportunity for questions and answers. Just copy and paste those into the main chat when we get there, and we can try and answer them as we go along. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Is there a mechanism to incentivise the early adoption of low emission fuels to offset the additional cost by crediting for the emissions avoided?
Yes, so in the US, they've put in place incentives like that. So producers of fuels are credited per litre basically for the alternative fuels that they can help bring down the cost of them. The other sort of incentive mechanisms that countries are looking at are giving sort of a guaranteed price to producers, which the UK is looking at, so that if they can't sell their fuel in international airline, then the government will step in and cover the losses. And also trying to support uptake by requiring the use of fuel by national airlines as well, to give that long-term certainty of demand to producers so they have the confidence to invest in new facilities.
Fantastic. So that's all we've got time for in terms of the specific questions about international shipping and aviation. If you'd like to come back to the plenary session, the main session, where we'll be able to answer further question and answer, just hit the big red button on the bottom and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the main session now, where we've got the team from the Commission here, from each of the emissions budgets team, the 2050 target team and the international shipping and aviation team. So, how can you make a submission? Well, once you've read the consultation documents and you're ready to provide your feedback, you can go onto our online platform, which is haveyoursay.climatecommission.govt.nz, where you'll be able to not only download the documents, but there is an online citizen-based form where you can make your submission by going in and completing each of the boxes. It's not compulsory to complete every single box, you can skip through them, but obviously if you've got information on each of the projects, then that is a really good way to do it. There is alternative ways as well, so if you wanted to, you can feel free to put your submission all together and send it through in an email, and that email address is haveyoursay@climatecommission.govt.nz, or you can post a submission to us as well. Now, what is really important is just to make a note of the closing date for the consultation, which is Friday the 31st of May 2024. So after we've received all of the consultation feedback, what we will do is we'll consider each piece of feedback separately. We will use it, and where appropriate, we will reevaluate that through an analysis submissions process and actually reanalyze before we make our final decisions. We will be delivering our final advice to the government by the end of 2024 on all three pieces of work. That's the emissions budgets, the 2050 target review, and the international shipping and aviation review. And then the government will then consider our advice, and it will have a year to come back to us with what it decides in terms of accepting or not accepting our recommendations. So it's over to the question time now. So I know that for the International Shipping and Aviation Review that we were in, there were certainly quite a few questions coming through, and hopefully it will be the same for the others. So we're going to move on to the questions now. And the first question is, does your analysis quantify the value to New Zealand for reputation impacts to meet its emissions budgets and emissions reduction target? So I think that's probably one for yourself, Gillian.
All right, I can make a start and Sam can jump in as well. So the main point to note over here is that the counterfactual that we are looking at with emissions budgets is not really one where there isn't any climate action. Climate action is happening. It's being driven by changing consumer preferences as much as it is with government policies as well. So our modelling is limited. We can't quantify the impact that you're talking about directly, but it is something which we are aware of and take into account as when we think about the risks of delaying decarbonisation.
Thanks, Gillian. Just to add to that, my role as manager of the land and waste team, we look at a lot of farming, and that's obviously a big export industry, as is forestry. And we're hearing a lot from big international food producers, supermarkets such as Tesco's, companies such as Nestle, that they are demanding low emissions goods and services in their supply chains, and that's having a big impact on us. And so it's fast becoming an issue of whether we get market access that we hit our budgets and targets.
Thanks very much, Sam. So the next question is for you, Rob. So any progress in international research on how to deal with radiative forcing regarding long-haul flights? So maybe if you could just explain what radiative forcing is for everyone, please.
Yeah, thank you. So radiative forcing is the other impacts that international shipping and aviation can have beyond the greenhouse gases that we already capture within our targets. So for international aviation, this is contrails and the clouds that aviation causes to form behind the planes in particular. And we know that that has a really big impact on the warming that international aviation causes from the research that has been done. But where the research does have some uncertainty in it is exactly how large that impact is. So we've had for a long time models around estimating the scale of this, but then we had a real world example of it with COVID, where there was a lot less flights, and those models haven't been redone basically since that occurred to show what the impact is if we change the level of those impacts. So we're really interested in people's feedback on whether we should be including those factors within the target if we were to include international shipping and aviation, and if there's any other research that we should be aware of that we haven't highlighted within our discussion document.
Thanks very much, Rob. So the next question we've got is your demonstration path in the draft emissions budget advice a forecast or a target?
it most certainly is not a forecast. So it's worth clarifying this because it is an area of, I guess, misunderstanding with the budget's advice. So what we are doing with the demonstration path is not saying this is what we expect will occur in the 2036 to 2040 period, but it's more what needs to occur to be able to deliver the emissions reductions needed to set the economy on a path in line with what we have demonstrated. And I guess the most important point to note is there are multiple ways to get there. But this is our assessment of the path which gives the most benefit, taking into account both the emissions reductions that are needed, but balancing it against the other considerations like the economic impacts, the environmental impacts, social consequences, etc.
Thanks very much, Julian. So the next question is, who gains advantage from goods and services? Is it the importer or the exporter? And is it possible to assign emissions responsibility to these?
I can take that if you'd like, Martin. So there's two basic ways in which emissions can be measured. Those are called production accounting and consumption accounting. Production accounting is the method we use now, in which the producer of the goods, in our case the exporter, is responsible for the emissions. And that's the global standard. And that's mainly because it's easier to account for. The other way is consumption emissions, in which the final consumer is ultimately responsible for the emissions. So we would pay for the emissions on things like cars and dishwashers and things like that that are produced overseas. You need a lot of data to make that work. What we're also seeing is international companies across the spectrum taking more and more responsibility as they need to have climate-related financial disclosures that include their international supply chains, which ultimately will sheet home emissions to the products that they sell.
Thanks very much, Dan. So this is quite a generic question. How is New Zealand actually tracking on emissions reductions at the moment?
All right, I'll take that one. So this is quite a nice pitch for our emissions reduction monitoring work, which will be released for the first time this year in July this year, and it's an annual report that we will be providing. And what this report does is it monitors progress against the first emissions budget, as well as provides an assessment of how we are tracking against budgets 2 and 3. So watch this space.
Wonderful, thank you. And given New Zealand's geographic location and relative wealth and associated relatively high emissions in international shipping and aviation, shouldn't we be courageous and support the International Maritime Organisation and the International Civil Aviation Organisation's work in this arena and include within the targets?
Thank you. So that's the key question that we're keen for your feedback on through this consultation process, is whether we should be including those emissions in the target. And definitely those are all factors that we should consider. New Zealand's long distance from our main countries that we trade with and that we travel to does mean that the costs of transitioning to reduce our emissions could be higher for us than other countries, but it also means that there's much greater risk for us involved, both if we don't transition and if we get the transition wrong for these emissions. And one of the things that the target can do is help provide that stable long-term framework for how we reduce those emissions. And absolutely, when we consider, what New Zealand should be taking impact for, taking responsibility for, we do need to acknowledge that, New Zealand is a higher than average income country. And so, we can be expected under the Paris Agreement to play a significant role in reducing our emissions.
Thanks very much, Rob. Another one for you, Rob. Popular today. So how are the impacts outside of New Zealand jurisdictions of New Zealand vessels bottom trawling fishing? This is regarding the release of greenhouse gases, and so how do they get captured and counted against New Zealand's budgets, or don't they?
So I can answer for the international shipping and aviation perspective. The emissions from fishing are already counted within the target. So where there is fishing, including in international waters, the emissions for it gets counted against whichever country that vessel refueled in. So we're already accounting for fishing, including in international waters, and where bottom trawling may be occurring. In terms of the impact of seabed emissions, though, I might pass that over to budgets perhaps to comment on.
Caught me out over there. So in relation to seabed, can you repeat that part of it, Rob?
So how New Zealand's currently accounting for seabed disturbance and how we count our emissions.
Okay.
It's worth passing over to Barry for that one.
Yeah, I can pipe up here. Generally speaking, that's a really good question. If the quick answer is that we at the Commission rely on the method of accounting that Sam mentioned earlier, that that the Minister for the Environment accomplishes every year, and that is the National Inventory Report. And what you've just asked about is a specific element of the National Inventory Report. And if you look down at the bottom, it's related to basically the Earth breathing, and it's about biogenic or naturally occurring biogenic emissions and how land use change works and all that stuff. So rather than try to recite what's included in that line item of the National Inventory Report, if you want to follow up with us via email after, we'd be happy to direct you to that part of the National Inventory where you can get the fine print for that very detailed question. So apologies that I can't recite it, but I do know where to find it.
Thanks very much. So next question is, have you considered the current reform programs underway in the electricity distribution space and how these will impact the market and roles in electricity? Who would like to say that?
Shall I take this one?
Thanks, Julie.
So we do have a specific team in the Commission that specialises in the electricity sector and will be in the energy sector, I should say, and will be all across this question. But what I will say in relation to budgets is that there is a very important role for electrification, for decarbonising transport, industrial processes as well, and there is an associated need for electricity. And in our modelling, what we have assumed is that the increased demand, so it's what, a 64% increase in demand relative to 2021, can be largely met by hydro, wind, and solar generation.
I can just add one thing there, Gillian. I think that's a really good question to illustrate the insight that you get from the different pieces of work that the Commission does. So with the budgets work, it's really looking forward into what are the outcomes that are reasonable to shoot for across different sectors of the economy and how does it all add up. It is not, as Gillian said earlier, forecasts based on current circumstances or issues of the day. So from that point of view, the current actions are not explicitly forecasted out, but on the other hand, as Gillian mentioned earlier, we do have an annual monitoring function where we will be taking a look, every year, what's in the policy mix, how is it working, is it creating barriers, opportunities, or gaps towards meeting the budgets of the day and future ones. So I think the answer is it's a mix of not exactly, but kind of, and a lot later through different work streams. So that's a little bit unsatisfying, but it is the reality of how Parliament directed us to do different kinds of work that will ultimately lead to transparency about what's working and what isn't.
Thanks very much, Barry. I'd just like to take this opportunity as well, because I know that there are still questions coming through. Please take a note of the email address so that if we don't get through to your question, then there will be time, we will be able to answer those questions if you've got those via email as well. But I think we've still got time for a few more questions. So the next one is, do you consider public sector emissions reduction targets as well for your modelling, or just from the industrial economic activities? Who would like to take that one?
Right, I can have a go. So I guess I'm interpreting this question as what emission. So how do we measure emissions that are that count towards the target? And in the budget's advice, we do provide advice on the rules that that apply, and this is based largely on what is counted in the greenhouse gas inventory. So what we do largely aligns with it. I guess the other thing that I'd say is when we initially provided advice on the rules that apply, this was back in 2021 when we were providing advice on budgets 1, 2, and 3, and we comprehensively went through an assessment of the rules. This time round, and I should also say that the government broadly accepted the advice that we put out at the time. So what we've done with the draft advice for budgets now is had a look at the specific areas where there was further progress that was being made, and have come to an assessment that there hasn't been enough that has changed between 2021 and now for us to take another fundamental look at the accounting rules. So that's something that we will look out for in future pieces of advice.
And I can just add one more thing on there, Gillian. So the public sector, I think the question was specifically with respect to public sector emissions targets. And that's a really good example, but there are other emissions targets, in different organizations or regional councils or whatever across the country. And the short answer, the way to think about this is that, the budgets work that Gillian and Christy are talking about are the umbrella under which all of those different things will stack up and add up to something. So if the emissions are happening in New Zealand and are part of the accounting machinery that makes up the National Inventory Report, then whether they will be relevant to achievement or missing the budget. The fact that they are, under the umbrella or part of a corporate or public sector emissions reductions target, well, those are the kinds of action we would expect those entities to take to be able to achieve the budgets that we're shooting for.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's no special carve out for public sector emissions.
Yeah.
If a public sector body is causing emissions, then it is counted and contributes to budgets and targets.
Thanks very much. So a separate but related question now is, will modelling for the emissions budget 4 be updated to reflect the current government policy and intent?
Yes, so the draft advice as it stands at the moment has government policy included as at 1 July 2023. But it is important for the modelling to be updated to reflect latest available information, particularly because budgets are in place for a long period of time, and we want it to be to be providing people with a significant and certainty, right, to be making investment decisions. So what we will be looking to do is between now and when the final advice is released at the end of the year, we will be going through a process to try and include as much new information and updated information as is possible, including government projections.
Thank you. So the consultation documents recommend shifting to electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered vehicles to lower emissions. However, it's not clear if you've taken into account the end-to-end impacts of both of these options and the impacts their creation has on Te Taio.
All right. So, yeah, that's a good question. So what we're looking to do in the budget space is, like I said earlier, balance what is achievable in emissions reduction, in the emissions reduction space, as well as the impacts. So one of the considerations is particularly the environmental impacts, but there are other considerations as well, as I mentioned a bit earlier. So in terms of the assumptions around technology, what we have looked to do in the draft advice is think about what's currently economically and technically feasible. So for the large part, this is electrification. But we do also consider so the question is particularly talking about hydrogen, so we do consider the larger energy demands associated with that. And I guess the other point to note is that we do have the ability to revise budgets, or at least propose that budgets are revised, and this is to account for the fact that technology can move quite quickly. And so with the draft budget's advice at the moment, it's both the levels that we are recommending on as well as revisions to set budgets.
But if I could just pipe in there, Gillian, the most important point there is that we're not, through the budgets work, we're not recommending the outcomes that the question said about certain uptake of hydrogen or EVs and all of that. The different scenarios in the budget's work illustrate the outcomes of different bundles of assumptions around those spaces. So as Gillian said right off the hop, the different scenarios are not forecasts. They are illustrations of different states of the world that could happen under different assumptions. And I think the last point about the end-to-end impact, and especially on Te Taio and other elements of ecosystems, that's the kind of input that we'd really love to get through this consultation cycle. So if you're looking at the work and you think that we haven't covered that off well enough, then we'd really appreciate you taking the time to make a submission and giving us your point of view on that. Us learning that kind of thing from people out there outside of the Commission is what will ultimately improve our work. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So have you considered the latest gas supply and demand data or annual report in scenarios or potential gaps in energy security with the demonstration path?
Yes. Yes, we have, is the short answer. So to expand on that a little bit more, yes, as part of this consultation process, we are out there speaking to different agencies, running many sessions like this, and are getting feedback on what is in our advice and what isn't, and what we should be accounting for. And in terms of gas supply and availability, that is something which is incorporated and in the current draft advice. And between now and the end of the year, we'll be updating it for the latest data on gas supply as well. To the second point on energy security, again, yes, and when putting together the draft advice, we have considered, I guess, in terms of gas supply, one of the assumptions is that around switching fuels away from gas for everything outside of electricity by 2050 from memory. And the reason for that is that there is a role for energy, for gas to be supplying electricity beyond then.
And the only other thing that I would just add to that is that the information and evidence that we included in our draft advice was as at July last year. So just for thinking about kind of what information we were able to include at that time. So we will definitely be updating our evidence and information in this final advice.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. So a question on the agricultural sector, who say that New Zealand has the least emissions, but with new methane reducing mechanisms working in other countries, is this strictly true?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's important to say that this claim is typically related to lowest emissions per unit of product, so per kilogram of milk solids or kilogram of meat. Certainly for kilogram of milk solids, there is evidence to suggest that we do currently have the lowest emissions, at least on average. But one of the significant change findings we found in the work on targets is that the introduction of methane reducing technologies that work in other countries' systems but don't work in our systems is going to very quickly erode that advantage.
Thanks very much, Sam. So where the IPCC modelling is relevant, what mechanism or chapter in the draft report deals with the changes to any updated IPCC modelling? And therefore, what is the time lag in accuracy between the outputs?
Do you want to go ahead, Corin?
Yeah, I can go. So in the 2050 targets review, we use IPCC modelling, particularly from AR5 and AR6 in a few areas. Chapter 2, talking about New Zealand's contribution in the context of where the world needs to get to. We're drawing on it there. With our significant change finding around the scientific understanding, we use IPCC modelling, looking at the impacts on the climate of different amounts of warming. So that's in chapter 3 of the target review.
Thanks very much, Corwin. Next question is there any engagement with iwi Māori when developing this advice? How are these insights gathered, and if so, how? Who would like to?
Yeah, I can speak to that in general. So yes, we do have a consultation and engagement stream targeting iwi Māori people. So I think that's a quick yes. And then, sorry for the person scrolling, I just need to read the second part of the question. Oh boy, it's gone.
That was how are those insights captured?
How are they captured? I'm not sure how to interpret that. I'm not sure how to interpret that question, so I'll just encourage the asker to follow up with us through the channels that Martin spoke about, and we'll try to answer that thoughtfully. I don't get it on the spot, so I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. Apologies.
Yeah, and just a slight addition to that as well. Certainly within the International Shipping and Aviation Review document, we've got specific questions about how a transition might look for Māori and how we could actually use Mataranga Māori, for example, to reduce emissions. So we'd be very, very clear, very, very keen to have your feedback on that. We have run a series of Zoom with Māori, specific to each of the sectors that have come up with this consultation. So we've done consultation with Māori on international shipping. We've done consultation with Māori about what that could look like for international aviation as well. And I know that the other teams have done something very similar, and we've done some across the board as well.
Yeah, we've also looked at a variety of the literature that's out there, directed to us by our experts in the field, and the insights from that as it relates to how you'd set a target can be found in Chapter 3 of that report. Chapter 4.
Thanks, Sam. So the next question is, are you confident that the sector-based approach is picking up the systems level opportunities and risks in pathways, or is further analysis at systems level planned?
I can take that question. For the budgets project, the modelling that supports it, yes, we do have integrated models in the sense that there are connections between the different sectors. So in the supporting information to the budget's advice, we have a technical annex which talks through the different models that we use to support our advice. But what the message that I would provide to this audience, though, is that, yes, there are connections, and we look at the linkages between the different sectors. And in the breakout session earlier, we were talking about biofuels and the agricultural sector and forestry and the linkages between there. But models are limited in what we can capture. So in terms of the value that this audience can provide, and in submissions, if there are particular linkages that you think we can be better modelling or need to take it into account, yes, we're certainly interested in your feedback.
Thanks, Julian. Next one is green technology obsolescence waste factored into the assessments? How has this been environmentally factored? Who would like that question?
So I could say, generally speaking, if the waste emissions are coming from, waste happening in New Zealand, then that would mean that they are under the umbrella of the National Inventory Reporting Mechanism, and therefore they are taken into account. I think that's the simple answer. If they occur here, if those waste emissions occur here, then they're part of the mix.
Thanks, Barry. To consider new energy sources application to our economy, such as hydrogen and geothermal, etc.
Yes. There is. Yes. So as we were talking about earlier, we have the different, in the modelling, we set out the different scenarios which have different assumptions, which show in different states of the world, and different states of the world in terms of technology availability, but also systems change. So what needs to change in the economy to deliver different emissions reductions. And so we do consider different technologies over there. Thinking about the demonstration path itself, one of the important contributions is our assessment of what is economically and technically feasible. And we have our initial assessment is that there is a substantial role for electrification and biomass, and that's because of the energy demands associated with hydrogen. You've also talked about geothermal. One of the assumptions that we have in the demonstration path is that, the emissions from geothermal can be reduced through carbon capture and storage. Since I have the talking stick, I'll just say one more thing, in that technologies can move quite rapidly. And we are talking again about long time horizons with the budget's advice. So it is important that we can and do provide advice on the extent to which budgets need to be revised. And one of the things we look to do over there is take into account new technology developments. So there is also that mechanism built into the budget's advice.
If I could just add for international shipping and aviation specifically as well, one of the things we've recognised in that space is due to the long distance that they travel, electrification is less feasible for those, so you're more likely to see a shift to alternative fuels in order to reduce their emissions. And if we did go down that road and New Zealand was to become an alternative fuel producer, then that would also open up new economic and employment opportunities for the country.
Thanks very much. So the emissions budget for discussion document says that you estimate that New Zealand could divert 80% of food and 95% of garden waste to composting or anaerobic digestion by 2050. What are the underlying assumptions on this, please?
I can take this one and give Gillian a break. So basically the assumptions that we used were based on government policy and strategy, including the waste strategy, to feed into what we thought would happen to waste in our demonstration path. But all our assumptions are published in our, on the supporting information on our website, so that should give you specifics to all those numbers.
Wonderful, thank you. So given the IPCC targets, why do you only plan for 54% reduction in gross CO2 and only 15% cut in NO2 by 2040?
I mean, I could say that there's two parts to this question. So you have the way the system works. So we have a New Zealand domestic target emissions reduction by 2050. Then you've got the budgets that need to take us on a path there in 5-year increments. And you've got the strategies and the policies under that get us there. So as far as where we're aiming for compared to the 1.5 Paris Agreement, 1.5 to 2, the purpose of our act, which is to contribute to limiting global warming to 1.5. This all becomes about, is our guiding star in the right place? Is the target right? Is it where we should be aiming for? And then in the target review document, we do look at different approaches to assessing New Zealand's contribution. What is New Zealand's fair share? We go through 4 approaches there with the conclusion that based on those approaches, we could have a stronger target, but this is where other factors come in, such as national circumstances and whether we have a significant change that points in that direction as well.
But I think the follow on there is then kind of the nub of that question is what is the balance that the country should be thinking about with respect to gross emissions reductions and levels versus sequestration and the role of currently forestry, which is the sequestration technology du jour. And I think that's the demonstration pathway and some of the other scenarios in the emissions budgets work demonstrates the outcomes of certain kinds of assumptions in those space. But I think it's important to get feedback on that. The Act is pretty clear that we have to think about the risks and implications and trade-offs of certain, courses of achieving the budgets. And so the different perceptions of risk or costs and benefits of a balance of gross emissions versus sequestration is super important to hear from folks out there.
Thanks very much. So we've probably got time for one last question, but I just wanted to acknowledge the fantastic questions that we have had coming through. This has been a really great interactive session. So we appreciate we can't get around to everybody's questions. So if you do have any unanswered questions or any burning questions that you want to be asked, feel free to send them through to the email address, haveyoursaye@climatecommission.govt.nz, and we'll do our best to get round to those as soon as we can do. So the last question then is, many exporters report international shipping and aviation to CDP and overseas customers. If these are included in the national inventory and targets, will there be guidance to align reporting, for example, methodology and conversion factors?
Yep, absolutely. One of the areas that we are keen for your feedback is on how we should count these emissions if we do include them with the target, and part of that is how we best ensure consistency with how businesses are reporting their emissions and how other countries are reporting their emissions. There are going to be differences between how exactly the government accounts for these emissions and how businesses account for these emissions. When businesses report what are called their Scope 3 emissions, they're reporting all the emissions that they cause through all the other businesses around the world. When we're looking at what a country accounts for, we're trying to look at what's a fair chunk for that country and trying not to overlap with what other countries are causing. So there's a bit of a difference there, but absolutely one of the things that has been highlighted to us as we've done this work is there's a mismatch at the moment because businesses are accounting for international shipping and aviation emissions through their Scope 3 emissions, but the government has no responsibility for them, which means there's a mismatch between what businesses and the government are trying to achieve around them. So acknowledging them within the targets is one of the ways that you could help resolve that mismatch.
Thanks very much, Rob. So as I say, that's all we've got time for now, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for your participation and the fantastic questions that we've had through. That's all from us. Ka kite.
Thank you.